it's been an interesting conversation about looking back and how to kind of approach the next few big burning issues, that we also kind of look at the lessons and the relevance of our namesake and what Bill Buckley's intellectual and personal legacy can teach us. And our moderator for such a panel is one of the best possible people for such a task. Ms. Bridges joined National Review in 1970, and she's liked it so much that she's just been there ever since. Serves as her managing editor, now is editor-at-large. Was a close, dear friend of Bill Buckley, helped in the later years of his life, served as his literary assistant, and has written a number of books along with Mr. Kimball on his works and collection of his writings. But we'd love to get started as soon as possible, so introduce Ms. Bridges.
Thank you, Harry. Now, you seem to be about the right height. Yes, I think so. Okay. The four members of this panel differ widely in background and areas of expertise, but we all have one great big thing in common, and that is that early in our careers, we were befriended by Bill Buckley, and we have spent the rest of our lives trying to learn from him and emulate him in our different ways. Note that I say the rest of our lives, not the rest of his life, for even though he died 5 years ago, and even though the political world has changed a very great deal since then, and no one back in early 2008 knew we were on the threshold of the age of Obama. But even so, we strongly believe that Bill Buckley still has a great deal to teach us about life and about politics. First, about life. Bill's friend Ronald Reagan was the principal speaker at NR's 30th anniversary, National Review's 30th anniversary celebration. And he talked primarily about how Bill and National Review had changed the national discourse. But then he ended his remarks by saying, "And Bill, thanks too for all the fun." Fun was a very important part of Bill Buckley's life. It framed how he made so many of his arguments. It framed how he treated his associates and his friends and his family. But fun is also, in the way Reagan was using the term, it's a matter of perspective. And Bill applied this sense of perspective to his political thinking. When it comes to the specific topic of this conference, the future of conservatism, it was Bill Buckley who argued most forcefully over the years that conservatism should not be factionalist. There was room in the conservative movement, he insisted, for traditionalists and libertarians, for social conservatives and economic conservatives, for Burkeans and classical liberals, and later on, neocons and paleocons. And even as a young man, Bill himself embodied what Frank Meyer later called fusion, the fusion of libertarianism and traditionalism. But now it's time to turn over the floor to my fellow panelists. Each of them has his own Buckley stories, and I don't want to preempt them by saying too much about their connections with Bill, but we need just a little here to set the stage. Neal Freeman was the first of us to join Bill's circle back in 1964 when he was just 2 years out of Yale. Bill hired him as a personal assistant, which basically meant that he did whatever Bill needed him to do. And just 1 year later, what Bill needed him to do was be second in command to Jim Buckley on the Bill Buckley for Mayor campaign. Neal also worked for the magazine in various capacities, including a stint as Washington bureau chief, and he served on its board of directors for 38 years. He founded and still heads the Blackwell Corporation, an advisory firm, and he serves on the board of the William F. Buckley Jr. program. Next will be James Panero. James came to Bill's attention via the Dartmouth Review, of which he was editor-in-chief. NR's longtime senior editor, Jeffrey Hart, was the Dartmouth Review's éminence grise, and he took good care to maintain good relations between the two reviews. James duly came to NR in 1998 as an editorial assistant, from which position Bill tapped him as his research assistant for the novel Spy Time, The Undoing of James Jesus Angleton. James is now the executive editor of The New Criterion, of which Roger Kimball is editor and publisher, and James writes for his own publication and a number of others on art, culture, architecture, and urban policy. Our third panelist will be Larry Perelman. Larry was born in St. Paul, Minnesota, 7 months after his parents emigrated from the Soviet Union. He eventually attended Macalester College in St. Paul, studying both political science and music, which fitted him very well to become friends with Bill Buckley, which he did after writing him a letter in 1994. Larry at the time was studying to be a concert pianist. He later decided not to try for the concert circuit, but his training, music training, stood him in good stead to do what he does now, which is managing director of Semantics Creative Group, which advises some of the leading performing artists and cultural institutions in the world. So, without further ado, let us start with Neal Freeman. Sure.
I'm going to stand. Feel free to do so yourself. Those chairs have not gotten any more comfortable in 50 years. First time I was in this building, I sat for exams in Latin and mathematics. And I aced the former and struggled with the latter, prompting my father to remark how shrewdly I had prepared for the modern world. William F. Buckley, Jr. Most of you knew him as an opinion journalist. Many of you knew him as a novelist. Some, not necessarily the most fortunate among you, knew him as a harpsichordist. A few, we happy few, knew him as a mentor. If the term were not usefully employed elsewhere, I would describe Bill's mentoring technique as the Heimlich maneuver. He pushed, he pulled, he exhorted, he cajoled until he got your best work out of you. And when he did, he was boyishly delighted and promoted you to his well-connected friends. I should say that he promoted you shamelessly. As all of you here seem to be over the age of 18, I'll confess that one of the genuinely lascivious pleasures of the last century was to read your blind copy of a letter of recommendation about you from Bill Buckley. It gave you that same feeling you get when you read one of those big trend stories in the New York Times. Wow, what if that's true? I have been told that every Republican White House, from early Nixon to late Bush, employed on its speechwriting crew at least one alumnus of National Review. We all know how those staffers had been hired. Bill Buckley had written a letter so persuasive, so seductive, that the leader of the free world had no recourse but to bark at an assistant, "Quick, hire that guy before Governor Smith does." Every single one of them. And they had all been mentored by Bill Buckley, which may explain the disparity over the years between Republican performance and Republican rhetoric. Being mentored by Bill Buckley was not always the easy path. I remember the first time that I failed to meet the bar. In 1964, National Review sent a 4-man crew to San Francisco to cover the Republican convention. Bill Buckley, editor-in-chief of the magazine and de facto commander-in-chief of the Goldwater forces, a conflation of roles that probably would not be encouraged at the Columbia School of Journalism. Bill Rusher, the publisher of the magazine and head of NR's provisional wing, as we said. William A. Rusher signed incendiary memos with his initials giving them the appearance of having been issued by the War Department. Me, the fuzzy-cheeked editor, by then rigorously schooled in the NR style book, and a freelance reporter who was to be our eyes and ears around the convention floor. That first night, I presented Bill with the file for our daily edition. I watched as he worked his way through the stack of yellow foolscap, pleased that he was making only a few changes with that deadly red ballpoint. All of a sudden, he stands up, snatches a few sheets of paper from the stack, marches across our tiny newsroom, and holding the offending copy in his extended fingers, as if they were industrial tongs disposing of a toxic substance, he said, Neal, Das is allowed to roll his own. I had converted into bland, standard issue, NR style, a piece from our freelance reporter, John Dos Passos, one of the most celebrated prose stylists of the 20th century. I spent the next half hour restoring every syntactical eccentricity and learning for a lifetime an elusive concept known as the exception to the rule. Linda has asked us to adduce some lessons from Buckley mentoring. I'm happy to do so after bypassing, if I may, a few that are not universally applicable, such as Bill's dictum that the American household, to be fully productive, should be stocked with a full complement of downstairs maids. I agree in principle, of course, with that. But here are some that may be of more pertinence for those of you seeking to make a revolution. The first lesson: there is no such thing as a full-time job. For Bill Buckley, the work day, the work week, the work year, they were all infinitely expandable. The man had a prodigious capacity for work. You've all heard that remarkable datum that over the course of his career he published 53 books. What's more remarkable still is 54, and they're still coming. Every one of those books was written while he was fully engaged in some other project. Yogi Berra would say it more memorably than I, but it's amazing what you can accomplish if you work hard every single day for 60 years. 2 vignettes. In the early days, long before the right-wing conspiracy became vast, the hardcore would gather a couple of nights a week at the old Sunluck restaurant in New York City. The kitchen would close at 11 o'clock for everybody but Bill Buckley. The owners, immigrant Chinese and ferocious anti-communists, would set us up at a table in the back, 4 of us, 6, 8 of us. We would review the long day just completed and preview the long day just about to begin. You'll not be shocked to hear these tended to be wine and beer-soaked events. The rest of us would stumble home to bed in the small hours. Not Bill. He would walk across the street to his townhouse, go up to his study, and pound out a magazine article, or a column or two, or a chapter of a book. We were all 10, 15, 20 years younger than he, but unlike Bill, we were exhaustible. Second vignette. After we launched Firing Line and polished it and sold it city to city across the country, after it became clear that the show was a hit and that Bill was a star, I went to him and said it was time to recruit my successor as producer. Bill was shocked. Why would I leave? Didn't I like the show? I reminded him that I was running a division of a multinational corporation, that I was producing 2 regular columns, that I was ghosting a book for a presidential hopeful, and that my wife had just brought our first child home from the hospital. Bill's response was, "And?" You can always pick out the Buckley protégés. They work like dogs. Or as Bill would have put it, they work like, anybody? They work like Stakhanovites. Bill did more for old Stakhanov than the Soviets ever did. The second lesson, and corollary to the first, there is no useful distinction to be made between work and play. I was lucky over the course of a half century to dine with Bill on hundreds of occasions. There were always occasions where you'd get a good meal and sparkling conversation, but they were always part of a networking opportunity, a talent scouting expedition, an information gathering exercise, or when Bill was on his game, a combination of all three. Since he worked all of the time and assumed that his associates would do likewise, he went to great lengths to make work fun and to make friends of his associates. For the inner circle, the pay was abysmal, the hours were long, and the psychic benefits were out of this world. Lubricated by copious amounts of Buckley charm, the machine worked at high efficiency. Those of you with management experience, however, will discern the flaw in Bill's system. There would be those moments, inevitably, when his cherished friend became his unsatisfactory colleague. Those were moments of agony for Bill. Despite his public image as a let-him-eat-cake conservative, in management terms, he was a pussycat. He couldn't bear to fire anybody. So in Buckley fashion, what he would do is contrive elaborate schemes by which his unsatisfactory colleagues would be hired away by somebody else. These became quite Byzantine. I received a few of these calls over the years. Bill would be in full sales mode. If his friend and soon-to-be former colleague was an advertising man, Bill would project his career as likely to make Madison Avenue forget David Ogilvy. If his friend was a financial executive, his acumen began roughly where Warren Buffett's left off. And if he happened to be a writer, well, Bill's man had somehow managed to combine the best qualities of Marcel Proust and Seamus Heaney. Those of you who have dealt with Bill over the years know that it was imprudent to let him gain rhetorical momentum. You could find yourself ensnarled in polysyllabism. The only chance you had during one of these outplacement calls was to break his rhythm. You'd interject in a firm but worldly tone saying, "He's just not working out, is he?" Bill would pause and say, "Not comprehensively." There are people who to this very day don't know that they were fired by Bill Buckley. I may be one of them. The third lesson, and much the most important of the three, mentoring is not an optional activity. It is a central function of leadership. For Bill Buckley, mentoring was serious business. For him, it wasn't either noblesse oblige or charitable gesture in the Catholic idiom. It was a core responsibility to the conservative enterprise. I remember one late night at the New York Yacht Club, his favorite haunt for a time. He was uncharacteristically gloomy, almost uniquely gloomy. our proximate challenge, as he saw it, was not so much political or intellectual or financial as organizational. As he put it, we had 200 absolutely essential jobs to be performed in our national enterprise, and only 20 competent people to perform them. This was the early days of the conservative movement. We were in much better shape, manifestly, than the Obama administration, but we had a severe shortage of management talent. If our conservative enterprise, what we called at the time, this was the time of tabloid journalism chasing mobsters around New York, we called it the La Cosa Nostra. If we were to be a national force, we couldn't be a platoon of second-raters, a pickup team of part-timers. If we wanted to pull off something big, we were going to need good people, and lots of them. Until that night, my sense had been that Bill had always thought of himself as a protege, as the beneficiary of guidance from his mentors, the John Chamberlains, Wilmore Kendalls, the Frank Myers, the Jim Burnhams. But at about that time, he was then in his early 40s, Bill took stock of his fledgling movement and accepted the most important role of his life. He became a mentor, and for the rest of his time dedicated much of his energy, probably the majority of his energy, to identifying and inspiring wave after wave of promising young conservatives. This is critically important work, which I am proud to say goes forward here today at the Buckley program at Yale. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. I've been to every one of these annual conferences, and the Buckley program is really incredible. It's also a pleasure to be on what's certainly going to be the most contentious panel of the program, so get ready. I'm just going to use my introduction to tell a little story of what it was like to be, at age 22, Bill Buckley's assistant for a time on a book. The winter after my senior year in college, Bill Buckley invited me to Stade, Switzerland, to help him on a novel called Spy Time: The Undoing of James Jesus Angleton. Our program there followed much of what he had been doing each year. For a little over a month, he and his wife Pat and a small staff took over a chalet in the ski area in a village called Rougemont. Somewhere in Switzerland, Bill had stored a crate of old dictionaries, video cassettes of Brideshead Revisited, abstract paintings in leopard print throws. And in the days before his arrival, the staff used these items to convert the chalet into another Buckley office and home. And each year, Bill brought along a young college graduate to be his assistant. He put us up in the inn just down the hill. I first got to know Bill a bit as the undergraduate editor of the Dartmouth Review. Jeffrey Hart showed him a piece I had written. I think it was a review of the movie Kids, and Bill wrote back approvingly. That translated into an internship at NR and then an editorial job. But I had really only met him a handful of times when he called me into his office and asked me if I liked to ski. I said, "Yes, Mr. Buckley, I do." He put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Call me Bill." The invitation to Switzerland came the next day. "There's never a good time for a busy man to take a vacation," Bill once said. And since there is never a good time, he might as well take it whenever he wants. But Bill never vacationed, even on vacation. He never took weekends off, most likely because his greatest fear was boredom. So Bill gave himself the assignment of writing a book each year during his stay in Stade. The winter I was there, it wasn't one of his Blackford Oaks novels, but it was a Cold War thriller. The book was a fictionalized first-person story as told by James Angleton, the real-life head of U.S. counterintelligence. Angleton's arch-enemy in our book, as in real life, was Kim Philby, the famous double agent from the British Secret Service. Philby had been recruited by the communists as one of the Cambridge Five and defected in 1963 to the Soviet Union, where he was awarded the Order of Lenin. For Angleton, Philby was the spy who got away, and our novel hinted that it drove Angleton insane. So in Stad, while everyone else went on holiday, we made a novel. Bill woke up at 4:30 every morning and popped a few pills to get things going. I drove up to the chalet overlooking the mountain face of the Vide Minette at 7:30. Bill always lent out his four-wheel drive Peugeot to his young assistants. He handed me the keys our first day at the top of the hill and gave me a quiz about the route to get his morning newspaper. I didn't want to admit I couldn't drive stick. So I learned on the road from my hotel to the chalet and promptly burned out the clutch. We worked for several hours together every morning, our desks catty-corner to each other. The Goldberg variations, the Glenn Gould recordings, played in the background as Bill typed. If Bill wanted to set a scene in Beirut in the 1960s, he'd ask me to come up with the detail. Then we went to lunch in one of the hamlets dotting the resort or in the private restaurant atop the Wassengrad called the Eagles Club. Here we discussed what should happen next in the plot. How about we hide a gun in the camera? Let's kill off so-and-so. He had very little sense of where his book would go. Then we would ski for a few hours, and then we would return for the afternoon session. Buckley had it in him to write 1,500 words a day. After a month, you have a novel. But those 1,500 words needed a second pair of eyes, and that's where I came in. In his first drafts, character names changed, dates were all wrong. I helped fix those in the afternoon sessions. Then at 7 p.m., Julian, his cook, brought in a kir, wine and creme de cassis for each of us. We pull out the Dutch cigars and discuss the day's progress. Things moved quickly into evening. The Buckleys almost always included me in their entertaining, which was Pat's full-time job in Stad. She didn't ski. Where should we sit the Princess of Denmark, the actor Roger Moore, the pretender to the throne of Greece, the would-be Tsar of Russia? And Julian, do we have enough water canard for everyone? James, Bill would say, you sit here next to me. As every young person learned around Bill, he always wanted to hear your opinion, even if you didn't have one. To close out the night, he would have me sing standards while he accompanied me on the piano. This promptly cleared out the house. He liked to be in bed by 10. We repeated it all the next day. Of course, the time I had with him was a fairy tale, but it was also an intense experience. I imagine it was something similar for all the young people he brought in over the years, a list that runs from my co-panelists to Paul Gigot and Peter Robinson to Danilo Petranovic, who's here, and to more than one or two apostates. Being so close to Bill could be like staring at the center of the sun. It certainly caused me to evaluate the writer I wanted to be. After Stad, I ended up enrolling in an art history PhD program before moving on to my current job at the New Criterion. Bill and I kept up with overnight sails across Long Island Sound, where I met Larry, now a good friend. Bill also asked me to write to him often, and he was always encouraging in whatever turn my life was taking. In Miles Gone By, his most personal collection of essays, Bill devotes more than one chapter to his childhood music instruction. In addition to weekly piano tutorials, the Buckley children were exposed to an hour of phonograph listening 4 times a week by a tutor named Penelope Owen. Buckley tells us that, quote, Miss Owen loved music with a passion. The use of that word here is not platitudinous, because Penelope Owen would weep when listening to music, not always, not for every composer, but almost always for J.S. Bach. I believed her when she said that music is very serious business, as poetry is very serious business, as art of any sort is very serious business. That which is sublime can't be anything less. Certainly, his sense for the sublime connected with his faith in God. His greatest regret, he said later in life, was that he wasn't better at prayer. I'm sure Larry will speak in a minute more about Bill's love of music, but I mention it here because the passage reminded me of what it was like to be there in Stad. Bill was never a master at the piano, but he was a great virtuoso. In Switzerland, like a sort of music appreciation, Bill was giving me Buckley appreciation. Bill found music in words. He played them into his writing, channeling Bach through the computer keyboard. He was probably second only to Shakespeare in bringing words into circulation. Quote, why do we want to be party to diminishing the choices that you have when you're dealing with the language which you worship for its beauty, he once said. This virtuosity combined with his great vocal presence. Wilmore Kendall once said that Buckley could do as much with his voice as Laurence Olivier. I'm still amazed at how much he shared these gifts with someone who was an entry-level editor, and how much he believed in my help. Even when we were together in Stad and emphysema was starting to take its toll on him, his talents were dazzling. A sort of personal ebulliency sustains me, he once said. David Brooks said that for all of Buckley's contributions to conservative ideas, his most striking contribution is to the conservative personality. He made being conservative attractive and even glamorous. Bill Buckley's unabashed life performance was his answer to the fallen century that he had been born into, which he was determined to stand athwart. At the heart of his conservatism was this great generosity to convey his brilliance through example, to reach across generations, and to have us close enough to listen in. Thank you.
James, that was really beautiful. And Neal, really enjoyed your remarks, and it's really an honor to be here. And Lauren had to, I think, step out for a second, but I think what she's done and what the whole team has done for the legacy of Bill Buckley would make him very, very proud. I'm a little bit of an outlier here in that I was not really a political or journalistic protege of Bill's, and I was outside of certain circles, and how the friendship really developed and the mentor-protege relationship developed, to me, is kind of a signal for us in terms of where we should really learn a lesson from Bill Buckley. We can all learn a lesson. I'm sitting here because I wrote a letter to Bill Buckley 19 years ago last week, and he wrote back 19 years ago yesterday, and from that moment, my life changed. And what Neal spoke of in terms of these platitudinous, hyperbolic sometimes, and many times, adjectives or whatever else Bill would throw when promoting, he was a master promoter. But what that did to us was it made us believe we were capable of being those people. We were capable of greatness because he said it. That was something that, to me, that was the magic of Bill Buckley. You know, we live in a cynical, very cynical age. It's been cynical for a while. But the fact is, he was happy. He was fun. And I think that is what, in many ways, is missing. And we can learn that from Bill. So I would like to read, with that as a preface, an article that I wrote, because I kind of tackled exactly what do I want to say. I said this once before, and I think it's important to restate today exactly what the relationship was and what it meant to me. And I happened to have dinner with Bill the night before he passed away. I was supposed to play a recital the day he died at his house. I played 15 recitals in the years leading up to that. And we had a great, great friendship based on music, which, in a way, Neal was talking about his harpsichord playing. I think all of us would be at a loss in a big way if he had been a better musician, because he loved music so much, he probably would have pursued that course. I don't think that would have been, without a doubt, his life love of music. So this was an article I wrote called The Last Supper with WFB, and it was published the day after he passed away. I've recently returned from Stanford, where I had been scheduled to play Beethoven's Diabelli Variations for WFB and his friends on Wednesday night. Instead, I found myself sitting down to write this tribute to my friend and mentor. He knew well that he was the most important person in my life after the two people who had actually given me life. I will cherish the hundreds of memories of his boundless acts of generosity, which changed my life forever. Bill and I had dinner on Tuesday, the night before he passed away. I've chosen to write about this because I'd like for his family, friends, colleagues, and readers to know that it was just like any other Buckley dinner. It started with cocktails, and it ended with cognac. I arrived at Bill's at about 6 in the evening in order to run through the performance I was to give the following night. Bill and I had a tradition where he would choose the next work for me to learn and perform for National Review editors and friends, many of whom are here. Over the years, I've played at least a dozen recitals featuring Bach's Majestic C minor Partita, the E minor Partita, Beethoven's Tempest Sonata, as well as the last 3 Beethoven sonatas, among others. I left my bags in the appointed room and approached the music room's doors with trepidation, as I heard Bill wasn't feeling well that night. But knew he might have ventured for a meal to this room he so adored. I heard his oxygen machine roaring over the sounds of the evening news on the projection television. Opening the door, I saw Bill tinkering with the remote control, a soda and mixed drink with orange juice on the table nearby. The music room has a glorious harpsichord and a large sofa, and its walls are lined with bookcases all around, save for the large windows offering breathtaking views of Long Island Sound. I gently placed my hand on Bill's shoulder, and he looked up. In his trademark style, he uttered, "Hey, buddy," a salutation his friends know well. I replied, "Hi, Bill. It's great to be back." He immediately asked what I'd like to drink, and I chose red wine. He rang the kitchen staff to bring the wine. Dinner had officially begun. I made myself comfortable on the couch next to Bill, and we chatted about some odds and ends. My mother, Celia, and I had ventured out to Bill's last week so I could premiere the Diabelli variation for Bill and members of his family. He loved this piece and convinced me to learn it after an initial hesitancy on my part. I mentioned to Bill what an honor it was for me to perform it for him, and he conveyed his delight and noted the impression that my sweet mother had made on the gathering. The first course arrived, and it was simply red caviar and creme fraiche on toasted baguette. Bill inquired, "Would you like some vodka?" I replied in the affirmative. Bill then raised his shot glass, and I mine, which followed with a clink and swift consumption of the perfectly chilled vodka. I found it incredible that here we were toasting with chilled vodka while watching news footage of the New York Philharmonic in North Korea. My parents and family fled the Soviet Union in the 1970s, and I was the first American-born child in my family. I wrote to Bill at the age of 18 expressing my gratitude to him for having emboldened Soviet Jews to come here to this great nation and asking for the opportunity to express my gratitude to him by playing piano. Now here we were 14 years later, toasting to all good things with vodka and red caviar. It was very special, and soon our glasses were refilled. The second course arrived as the sounds of Beethoven's Fourth Piano Concerto filled the room. This course consisted of wonderful fish, green beans, and some of the best mashed potatoes I had ever had. Bill reminisced about concerts he had heard from the 1930s. Specifically, he mentioned hearing this, his favorite concerto, performed in London in 1938. He then turned to me and asked, "Do you think the harpsichord is today facing its greatest challenge as a concert instrument?" This was classic Bill, and although far from being an authority on the harpsichord, he was one. I agreed with his observation. In front of us stood one of Bill's harpsichords, indeed one of his prized possessions. Our conversation ranged from politics, North Korea and the primaries, to culture, to mutual friends, James Panero for one. James and I met on Bill's boat Petito in 2001. We were 25 and best friends to this day. I mentioned to Bill that if not for him, James and I wouldn't be friends, and noted that many friendships were created as a result of his largesse. He remembered our sail to Oyster Bay. I then told him that James and I had tried to live the Buckley life for a period. We defined the Buckley life as waking at 5 a.m. and heading to sleep at 10 p.m., Bill's incredible regimen. I explained to Bill that in order to make it work, James and I would call one another at 5 a.m. to make sure the other was awake. It lasted for barely 2 weeks. Bill roared with laughter. Bill soon said, "We must talk about your performance, the issue of repeats and the Diabelli variations. What do you think?" The Diabelli variations is an hour-long epic work, and almost all of the 33 variations are repeated. Bill's question brought a smile to my face, and I said, "Bill, I'll repeat only the best variations, and it should clock in at about 40 minutes. He then told me about the guests who would attend, asked of my preference to play before or after dinner. I always played before, and finally asked if I would like some cognac. We finished up dessert, which for me consisted of a lemon tart and for Bill a plate of fresh watermelon. The lighting in the music room and throughout the house always created an effect that I can only describe as that found in Victorian-era paintings. Bill gave his 2 Cavalier King Charles Spaniels the chocolate chip cookie they obviously had been expecting, one playing with the cookie on the floor between the two of us. Bill adored his dogs, and this, the newest addition, he would refer, "Isn't he a champ?" was just 5 months old. Just after 8 o'clock, Bill bid us good night, and I helped him make his way to his room. The Diabelli variations were not played on Wednesday evening, but I was honored to have ever played for Mr. Buckley, who on his insistence became my friend Bill. His love of music was second to none. He was the most dedicated member of any musical audience, whose empathy was almost tangible as you worked your way through a performance. He was and is in the pantheon of great men, intellectual giants, and artistic geniuses. It was all a great honor to have had my life changed and enriched by William F. Buckley, Jr., a second father, encouraging mentor, and honest friend. Cheers to you.
Now, because this panel started late and some of the people of the next panel have to leave right after they speak, the organizers have asked us to stop right here. We'll hope that we can talk with many of you after the last panel is finished, perhaps over dinner at the reception. But for now, this most contentious panel of the day, we'll wrap it up, and thank you all.
Over.